This episode of the Sam Oldham podcast is sponsored by Turn, the only brand dedicated solely to men's gymnastics. Towards the end of my career, I started to work closely with the team at Turn to design custom uniforms that expressed who I was and where I came from, and they were always able to bring my ideas to life. For years, I wore uncomfortable gymnastics clothing until I started to wear Turn, whose uniforms are built with their attention to detail and quality in mind. Go check them out now at turn-gymnastics.com and enjoy the episode. In 2023, at the Artistic Gymnastics World Championships, Team USA took the bronze medal in the men's team final. They are now among the favourites to finish on the podium at the 2024 Paris Olympic Games for the first time since the Beijing Games 16 years ago. Individually, their squad is incredibly strong, and the impressive comeback achieved by Brody Malone to be crowned the US champion last weekend after 3 knee surgeries in 2023 surprised the gymnastics community. With the likes of Fred Richard, Koi Young, Yul Moldauer, Asher Hong, Shane Wiskus, and Donald Wittenberg, among others, all hoping to make the Olympic team, it's going to be a classic American dogfight to see who the men will be that are selected. Today, I'm joined by Kinsley Behel. She's of Neutral Deductions, the social media platform dedicated to men's gymnastics, and this is our story. How was that, Kinsley? Was that okay?
It was good.
Yeah?
It's Kinsley Beal. I don't know if you...
Beal, okay. That will be my accent again, like we were talking about just before I went live.
All good. All good. It doesn't bother me. I just, depending on how specific you want to be,
It's okay. We'll go with it. Okay, Kinsley, like I said, thank you for joining us. It's great to have you here. We did a recent episode on the Japanese Olympic selection process that went down really well with the viewers. They really enjoyed that. And I learned a lot myself, so I'm sure it's going to be the same today. Just to start off with, before we get into the US Championships, Kinsley, can you just tell me a bit about your gymnastics story and how you got into the sport?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. My entrance into the sport is a little bit different than I think most people. Of course, I did the little kinder gym and things like that. But when I got into middle school, my parents said, you need to choose between music and you need to choose between gymnastics. And I ended up choosing music. But in my master's degree program, there was an option to join the club gymnastics team. And so I joined the club team at the University of Michigan. And while I was there, I learned that there was an open spot to work with the Michigan men's gymnastics team that had some very famous names on it, including one Sam McCulig.
Wow.
And I took this job. They didn't actually tell me what the position was. And I got there for my very first day, and it was running men's gymnastics meets. I had never been to a men's gymnastics meet, but I was going to run this collegiate level meet. And they showed me how it worked, and I just got it. And later that year, we ended up hosting the NCAA championship. So in 9 months, I went from never having been to a men's gymnastics meet to running the floor at the 2014 NCAA men's gymnastics championships. And then from there, everything just was like a tumbleweed. One of our alumni went on to work for USA Gymnastics and then ended up bringing me on as a volunteer to help run their media operations at major meets. My very first journalism gig was a journalist that I had met at that meet couldn't make the 2015 World Gymnastics Championships, and I was living in Germany at the time, and asked me if I would go cover it. So my very first assignment is the pre-Olympic World Championships. Wow. And, I showed up and I was trying to cover the meet with pen and paper, and everyone else around me had recorder devices. And so it was a big learning curve. And at that competition, Jessica O'Byrne from Gymcastic asked me if I wanted to come on as the men's gymnastics expert. And that started an 8-year run on the Gymcastic podcast. And then about a year ago, I started Neutral Deductions to cover men's gymnastics. And that's my entrance into the sport.
Wow, what an amazing story that is. And, that time when you took that position at Michigan, it was a great time to be there, right? Because that's when they were very successful and they won the NCAA championships, I think, a couple of times. What were your first impressions of men's gymnastics, being in that environment and seeing it live, having done some club gymnastics in the past when you were younger? What were those first initial impressions of men's gymnastics? What really, captivated you about the sport?
How powerful it was,
Okay.
Specifically on vault, right? Having been used to women's gymnastics that do a lot of Yurchenko entry vaults and men's gymnastics often doing more forward entry vaults, and seeing, I specifically remember the power of watching like Stacey Irvin and Michael Strathern doing their handspring double front vaults and just being in absolute awe. And I have to give a lot of credit to the the gymnast on that team, they took the time to prepare me and they taught me the skills and they saw my enthusiasm. And I remember watching parallel bars and being like, "Oh, that skill is so cool. What is it?" And they're like, "Oh, it's a peach basket. It's only a B. Like, it's not that impressive." And but they taught me the skills and they taught me the scoring, and I owe so much to them.
Oh, wow. And so you really did spend that time, because I often talk about the difference between professionals that work in the sports medicine, the sports science side of sport, that come in and really integrate themselves straight into the sport, and they take the time to be in the gym, see the athletes, get to know the skills. So when an athlete comes to them for physio and they explain that they were doing a casino on high bar, they get it straight away because they can see the skill inside their head. They understand how the mechanics of the body are moving around the apparatus. So you really did spend that time initially getting to know the sport and learn the language of men's gymnastics, I guess.
Yeah, I spent a lot of time in the gym, and I think a lot of that was due to the fact that in my musical career wasn't going as well as I was hoping that it would go, and I was feeling a lot of acceptance in the gymnastics community at that
Okay.
time, and so I think it's a natural human tendency to gravitate towards what feels positive, and that was what was feeling positive to me at that time, and so I would spend hours in the gym and at the competitions and helping them prepare, and um, they taught me, and it's one of the greatest moments of my life.
You know, Kensley, almost with what you're doing now with nutriductions and then gymcastic and then what you did originally, you're almost... Those career paths don't really exist in men's gymnastics, right? So you're kind of having to carve something that doesn't exist yet. What did you learn in those early years of being given those opportunities, of going to the World Championships in 2015, where you turn up with a notepad and paper, everybody else has got voice recordings? You know, what are those very important things, and how much of it was you being very brave and just being willing to put yourself in that situation and be quite vulnerable and just think, right, I'm going to learn on the job here?
Yeah, I think that that's something to it. I, like you, or you've talked about ADHD, and I also have ADHD.
Okay,
And I
wow.
think some of that, what comes with it is a natural tendency to just get things that you're passionate about or to put the effort into things that you're passionate about. I think there's also a level of ignorance that went into it. And so I wasn't nervous because I didn't know what to expect. You know, Simone
Mm.
Biles just recently talked about going into her first Olympic Games was blissful because she didn't know like what to expect and what the pressure was going to be like. But the subsequent Olympics have been more stressful because there is a pressure and a level and an expectation. And while I certainly don't want to compare myself to Simone Biles directly, I think what she speaks is poignant for a lot of people of, yeah, showing up to that first world championship. I didn't know what to expect. I was like, sure, I know gymnastics, I can do this. And then I got there and it was incredibly eye opening. And of course, I have felt a subsequent increase in pressure because at that time, you know, Gymcastic was the only podcast, but it grew substantially. And then I had a responsibility
Mm.
to report correctly and then to be kind as well. And that was also a learned skill because I don't know if you watch Ted Lasso at all. But right, there's this show and there's a reporter, and the one of the main athletes comes to the reporter and says, you know, you were a dick to me and you said this awful thing about me. And the reporter says, I was early in my career, I thought I had to make a statement. And I really resonated with that because I think early on in my career, I said a lot of unkind things about athletes because I thought
Right,
I had to
okay.
make this really important statement to put my name out there. And it's been a long journey to learn how to be able to talk about performances critically, but not to be unkind to the athlete themselves.
Well, that is very honest of you to say as well, because I can clearly see how you would fall into the trap of doing that when you're starting out and you are potentially a little bit maybe insecure when you're in an environment like that where gymcastic has already got this big following. You're like, wow, I've got to say something that's going to make people listen. And, you know, I'm also, right now, I'm feeling like I don't know what I'm talking about. So I have to look like I know what I'm talking about. And it's very similar with young gymnastics coaches in particular. They come in, again, a bit naive, all ego, very scared of looking like you don't know what you're talking about. So I'm just going to pretend I know what I'm talking about. And so that's a learning lesson for everybody that everybody can relate to. So yeah, it's really helpful to hear that as well. We had a lad come on our podcast, a guy called Max Hayes, who is a young sports journalist who is doing amazingly well. It'll be great. I'm definitely going to send him just that because he's just starting out, but yeah, incredibly successful already, and he's just a teenager at university, and he's the guy that soccer in the UK is very big, right? And now, just at the age of 19, whenever there's a story about Nottingham Forest, all the major media outlets go to him at 19, which is a lot of pressure. So I think, hearing something like that from someone like you, and potentially myself, I podcast and I do bits of work on TV and I hope to do more in the future. Yeah, it's very useful to hear that and hear you be so honest about it. So yeah, thank you for that. When you got started, Kensley, and you had those first experiences at the World Championships doing the media work, after that, when you came back from that World Championship, what areas did you identify as being, right, I'm really out of my depth here. This is what I need to focus on?
I think knowing all of the skills and being able to know what I was looking for quickly, because there are 6 events running at one time, and I was used to meets where there were 2 events running at one time. And you have to be able to look up and know just kind of how the athlete landed on the apparatus. Okay, this is what they were doing, or knowing from the takeoff or the landing and things like that, because you're not always going to get the full skill just based on, right, I'm trying to type it out word for word as
Yeah.
I'm watching the meet. And that was, again, a big learning curve of how do I tell what's going on in the meet, knowing that I'm human and I can't capture all 6 events at
Mm.
one time, but how do I sort of story tell and push the narrative forward?
And when you're doing that, just because this is super interesting for me, because I have a real interest in, commentary and watching competitions and reporting. When you're watching a competition then, are you even watching the warm-ups? Because if you can see what skills they're gonna do, you're preempting the routine that's coming. So as long as it is the routine they're supposed to do and you're predicting that they're doing, you can then write more of the story parts because they're doing their normal routine. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I absolutely watch their routines ahead of time. I also watch their routines on YouTube ahead of time so that I can hopefully say, oh, this routine was actually not typically what they do. Like Hashimoto actually downgraded his floor routine at the World Championship. I think he did a 5.8 and his normal's a 6.0. And for this year, he's actually bumping it up to a 6.2, right? So it's my job to know that he has these different variations of floor routines so that I can, again, understand, like, did he mess up? Is he downgrading? Okay, if he's downgrading, is there a potential injury there? What's the reason for that?
Yeah, that's really fascinating to know, Kensley. We're going to get into the US Championships. Before we do that, because our viewers and our listeners found this very, very useful when we chatted to Catherine about the Japanese selection. Can you try and explain for us the American men's team Olympic selection process for this year in Paris?
Yeah, so they're doing something a little bit different this year than they have done in previous years. So there are 2 selection events that cover 4 days. So the 2 days of the US Xfinity National Championships that recently just happened. And then in a couple of weeks, there are the Olympic trials happening in Minneapolis. And these are big events. That specifically Olympic trials is a sellout event. So it's really, really exciting to be there if you can. And then they're taking the best 3 out of 4 days of competition, and then also looking at all 4 days of competition. And if the teams match from giving the athletes a throwaway day, so using the best 3 scores and using the best 4 scores, that is the Olympic team named. Now, based on how inconsistent a lot of the athletes were at the national championships, unless they are incredibly consistent at the Olympic trials, I'm not sure that using an auto select team is actually going to come to fruition.
Okay.
So then you go down the list and they say, okay, using these scores, if the highest scoring team is is 2 points higher than the next highest scoring team, that's the Olympic team. Running the numbers after nationals, these teams are like 0.05 apart. I feel pretty confident saying that that's not going to happen barring disaster at Olympic trials.
Okay.
So then you go down you keep going down the list, and then it can go down to selection committee. And so if the selection committee happens, they have a set of discretionary criteria for what they will use. And interestingly, I am not sure that they are going to consider specialists as heavily as people think they might. So that recently a document came out from the senior selection committee, and they talk about how they've utilized specialists in the past and the results between using teams using specialists at the World Championships versus the team they used last year, which was all-arounders. And that was the team that ended up getting the medal. So I think if the team ends up going to selection, probably not looking at a one event specialist to fill that spot, maybe someone who does 4 events like Curran Phillips, depending on how he shows up at the Olympic trials. But that's sort of the overview of how they're going to select the Olympic team.
And so you're predicting that they're gonna go top 5 all-arounders. Potentially, if they're gonna go with all-arounders, it's gonna be the top 5. Is that kind of lined out? Do they have, for example, in Japan, they had, okay, if you're world champion or the Olympic champion, you're selected. Then we're taking the next best all-arounder, or the next 2 best all-arounders, so that's 3. And then they had their criteria for the next 2 spots. Are there any of the spots in the 5 team that are very clear?
So there is one spot that can be auto-selected, and that is if you win the Olympic trials and you're top 3 on 3 events. So interestingly, Brody actually would not have met that criteria. He was really, really close. He was obviously top on high bar. I think he was top 3 on still rings and 4th on pommel horse, if I'm remembering correctly. And on pommel horse, there were the 3 specialists who topped the standings. The guy who was in 3rd, he did not get invited to Olympic trials. So Brody very could easily achieve that at the Olympic trials, but it's not guaranteed. And same thing if Fred ended up winning or whatnot. A lot of them aren't top 3 on 3 events. They're top 3 on 2 events. Right. So again, I won't be selected if they don't have an athlete who is auto-selected onto the team.
Well, that's really interesting. How much do you think the fact that the American team won the bronze medal last year, and they have a real shot at winning a medal as a team, has played into their decision to focus more on all-arounders and not specialists? Do you feel like the American team really are, the team medal is their priority and everything else is a byproduct? Because I would argue that for the British team right now, it's probably the other way around. I think the priority looks like it's going to be individual medals, and then if as a byproduct the team is very strong, then they'll fight for a team medal. Does that make sense?
It does make sense. And I would say 100% the results of the 2023 World Championships changed the mind of a lot of people on the selection committee and the high performance team as well. Even though Brett, who's the high performance director, has said, like, we're looking at everyone, I really believe that medal made a huge difference for him because he's been working there since 2017, pushing D-score, trying to get them to that team medal. They finally got there. This is the pathway that they chose to get there, and it worked. Why would you necessarily go back and change and revert to a way that hasn't worked the past 9 years?
Yeah, and there was a question I was going to ask at the end, but I think it works to ask right now, Kensley, and that is, why has it, in your opinion, taken so long for the American men's team to kind of get to the position right now? And I know they did win that team medal, I believe, in 2014, right? At the World Championships in Nanjing. Why has it but right now, for me, I think the whole gymnastics community look at them as, right, if the American team go to the Olympic Games and they hit all their routines, they are definitely favourites now between them and Great Britain to win that medal. That's my opinion. In terms of the depth and the strength that they've got right now and the focus they're going to put on that team. Why has it taken so long to get to this point? And can you talk a little bit about when Brett came in, some of the changes in terms of the strategy of how he was going to select his teams were implemented? Because I read an article on that, and it might have even been you that wrote that article, but I found it very, very interesting that they were going to very much focus on the numbers and the maths. And when I had the conversation with Fred when he came on the episode, I was fascinated with the way that they had manipulated the D scores to try and increase that difficulty, then bring them back down. I thought it was genius.
Yeah, so lots of questions there, lots of complex answers too. So There's a couple things that I think have contributed to the US not being able to win medals internationally. I think one of them goes back to the NCAA system. So around the time of 2014, the NCAA programs made a change of instead of using 6 up, 5 count athletes in the competitions, they changed it to 5 up, 5 count. And since a lot of the national team athletes come from the NCAA program, right? That means that a lot of athletes aren't being able to be given that freebie slot. So if you have the best athlete at blast, everyone in my team is hit, I'm going to get a chance to practice my hardest routine because we can throw away my score if I fall. And so I think that contributed it. And Jonathan Horton, who's a 2-time Olympic medalist, he has also had the same opinion that that contributed to like maybe lower D scores or an increase in consistency. I think that they're in the selection of some of the teams. I think some politics went into it, maybe not necessarily selecting the best teams overall. And then honestly, it seems like maybe some of the teams, they didn't really get along, and that severely affected their ability to perform well at the highest level. And if you remember, at several of the Olympics in 2016 and in 2020, they were placing like first and second in qualifications. And then for the last 3 Olympic Games, they've ended up placing fifth overall. And so there is something that has happened between their ability to come in for qualifications and do really well. And then, okay, that pressure of, okay, we can do this. It's finally our year. And then maybe not being able to live up to that expectation. And maybe it's a mental thing. And I can't say that for sure.
Yeah.
But there's certainly been a pattern, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I completely agree with that. It's very interesting to hear about the college system because I do think that plays a key role. And I would often, when I would look at those college scores, I never used to take them seriously. So I'd be like, okay, we'll see how they'll compete internationally and then how they'll score. And a lot of the time, I think the college gymnastics, particularly in the past, but not so much now, because I think it has changed, because I watched the NCAA finals. I was very impressed with the depth and the level across the board, and the difficulty was the big thing for me. But in the past, it has a clear look. There are certain skills that would be performed in college gymnastics because they're safe and they're easy and they're consistent, but they don't translate very well to international gymnastics. And Fred, interestingly, said that himself. He said there is a difference in level between competing in the college system and then going internationally. So yeah, I completely agree with that. And again, you know, I competed against some of those American teams, and I always personally felt as a gymnastics fan that sometimes it was made up of very good individuals, but they didn't work so well as a team. That was always my impression. So when the pressure hit, they would crumble a little bit because they couldn't necessarily lean on each other as much as maybe the other teams. Whereas I felt like going into 2012, right, we had a common goal. We were working together. We weren't favorites. We had that naivety. That was a real advantage, whereas the American team qualified so incredibly well for that Olympic Games. And then when the pressure came, yeah, it kind of crumbled away a little bit. Okay, super interesting and very, very interesting to hear about the select. That seems incredibly complicated, the way that they're going about that. You know, I felt that the Japanese system was complicated. That seems even more complicated in some ways. So let's go into the competition then, Kensley, from the US Championships. Let's start with Brody Malone. When I was reading up ahead of this about his injury last year, to have 3 knee surgeries is incredibly remarkable. To have got back to the point that he's at right now. I think I watched maybe his Winter Cup at the start of the year where he wasn't, he was doing dismounts maybe, but no floor and vault. And I thought, if he's not doing floor and vault by February, I don't think he's going to be ready by June. So the job he's done, and the team around him have done to get him ready to look so, I mean, he comfortably won the competition. He looked incredibly consistent and solid, even upgraded some of his routines. And aesthetically, I was super impressed. For a big guy, you know, has a stockier build, to swing pommel that well is very impressive. What were your thoughts on his competition? And yeah, specifically, I guess, some of his routines that stood out for you, but just his gymnastics and where it's at right now, a month out from the games.
Yeah, you couldn't have said it better. I also thought at Winter Cup, I was like, oh, like, I think that Brody will end up being that fifth spot. He'll come in with 3 or 4 events. He'll do high bar. He'll definitely be a contender for a high bar world medal at the Olympic Games. And the rest of the team will be made of all arounders. And then he told me at that meet that he was going to be doing all around at the national championships. And I was like, there is no way. There
Mm.
is no way he's going to be doing that. And then as I saw him at the Olympic camp couple of weeks ago, I was like, okay, he's definitely back. He's ready. And I texted his coach, Syke Caesar, who was a teammate at Michigan, and I had gotten to know him pretty well. And I said, just out of curiosity, what are his D scores going to be on floor and vault? Because I was thinking he was going to do like a Souk full and like maybe like a 4 or 5 floor routine just so he could cover the team in case anything happened.
Mm.
And Syke texted me back and he said, oh, he has a 5-7 floor set and he's doing his COS 1.5. And I was like, oh, Brody's going to win the whole meet.
Yeah.
It just so impressive to see him stick a triple full dismount on floor with that giant brace. To me, was almost the most impressive piece of gymnastics he did. His upgrade on high bar, he's doing a 6-7 now, which is one of the highest D scores in the world. And his, I think it's he does a tuck half to Lucan,
Yeah.
which to me is just like chef's kiss. Like, what a cool combination to see. So those were the things that really stood out to me about him, and to have such a dominant performance after such a horrific injury is honestly miraculous.
Yeah, and there wasn't even, sometimes when an athlete comes back from an injury like that, as the viewer, you're kind of watching and wincing. But it wasn't. He looked very solid when he was landing. His legs looked absolutely fine. He was absorbing it all very, very well. He looked very confident in his leg. Sometimes you come back and you're kind of, I've been in that position where I'm basically taking all the weight on my other leg. But he wasn't. I was very impressed. Again, loved the upgrade on high bar. It seems like there are a lot of people going for that upgrade, which, I think a few years ago for me, high bar was quite far behind all the other apparatus. I think globally it was pretty weak. Now I think it's caught right up. In fact, it's probably one of the apparatus that's easily the most exciting to watch at the moment, because some of the combinations that the guys are doing are just incredible. You've seen the over the weekend, the guy from Taiwan do the
Tung Jiahong.
do the squat half Lucan as well. With the casino. To see a tall gymnast like that do that routine is just incredible. So, I think the big thing for Brody, obviously, on high bar is his big event. He's just incredibly consistent. He looks like he can just hit that routine incredibly easily. So, amazing that he came back. And I'd agree that, his high bar was a standout, but also his floor was very, very impressive. And like you say, to finish on a triple twist, we had Oka Shinosuke, who we spoke about on the Japanese episode, who's finishing on a 2.5 because he's coming back from a similar knee injury. So the fact that he's come back and he's doing that triple twist is incredibly impressive. Are you fully expecting him to go and be just as consistent at the Olympic trials? I mean, I can't imagine, bar there being an issue with his knee or anything coming up, he's going to have any issue. I mean, he looks incredibly consistent. One question I did have, all competitions in America now, are they all Spieth competitions, Spieth equipment?
I believe that Spieth is the partner with USA Gymnastics right now, which is really interesting. And I think we'll get more into sort of why are they not using the Olympic equipment and the Olympic gear, especially when you have athletes who have struggled with using Gymnova. Don't you want to test them and see how they're doing on that equipment heading into the Olympic Games?
Yeah, it seemed to me as well, and we'll go on to Fred in a moment, but a lot of athletes seem to struggle on that pommel horse on day one.
Yeah, I don't know if it was the apparatus itself. I wasn't actually there in person, so I didn't get the chance to ask them that. Or if it's just, oh my goodness, I've been waiting my entire life to be able to compete for a spot at the Olympic Games. It's pommel horse. It's day one of the cycle, and it's just not happening. I kind of wonder if it was more mental than the actual pommel horse, but I would have to ask them to know for sure.
Typically, Kenzie, most of the college clubs and clubs in the US, have they all switched to Spieth, or do they still train on AAI sometimes?
My understanding is that a lot of the gyms still have AAI, some have Spieth. I know that Mark Williams at Oklahoma has several different types of equipment in his gym, and he was able to get that because he's had so many Olympians over the year, and then you can get more funding to get whatever the Olympic equipment is going to be. Every gym is a little bit different. So I can't speak specifically to what is exactly in every gym, but I do
Yeah.
know for a fact that some of them still do have AAI for sure.
Yeah, because those two pommel horses are incredibly different. And when I would come to America to try and compete on the AAI, I would find it tough straight away because the leather would be quite soft. The handles would be almost like hollow and echoey. And it's the complete opposite to a Spieth pommel, which is rock solid, slippy. The handles are a little thinner, but they're not made out of wood, so they're very rigid. So yeah, it'd be interesting to know whether the athletes that struggled more maybe train on AAI rather than Spieth, because it is quite hard to jump from Gym Nova or AAI or whatever at Seno and then jump to Spieth. Sometimes can throw you off because it's very slippy. It's very hard. That's why sometimes you would see gymnasts put syrup on the pommel, because the leather can be very, very, very slippy. So quite often people will like wire brush or sand it down to put little grooves into it so you don't slip as much. Okay, let's go on to Fred. How did you feel about Fred's performance at the weekend? I think, to me, he almost looked better in some of the college meets earlier in the year. And I think maybe that is because he's trying to upgrade in areas. But I'd be very interested to know. I mean, it was still a very good performance, right? And he was comfortably in second. But yeah, interested to know your thoughts on his performance.
Yeah, so Michigan took an interesting approach to the athletes, and they rested both Fred Richard and Paul Judah through a lot of the early NCAA season because they knew that both of them would be in contention for this Olympic team, and they would need to rest because you can't go through that 13, 14-week season all out and then really be uninjured and healthy enough to do what USA Gymnastics is asking of these athletes for this Olympic selection. So this is one of his first performances doing all around this year. He hasn't done so many, so I think he gets a little bit of grace there. And he had to start on pommel horse for the very first rotation, and it didn't go super well. He just didn't look consistent, didn't look quite on, and I think he did get a little bit of maybe a bad rap on the broadcast, and they were saying like, oh, he's like not doing well, he's not doing well, he's not doing well. But if you look at the rest of his scores, the rest of the competition, they were all over 14. And so he really did continue just to climb up those standings. And for me, actually, even though his high bar is fantastic, what was most impressive to me is what he's done on still rings, because still rings is a place I would say the US is a little bit weak. And he scored over 14 both days. And I would not say that Fred has been historically like that would be a piece of apparatus that he's most known for. And so to see him come in and go 14 and 14-3 on the competition, I think for me is equally as impressive as any of the rest of the gymnastics that he did.
Yeah, I think, watching his routines, he's a very balanced all-arounder. And he has that little bit of a wow factor. It's exciting, when you watch each of his routines, you're waiting for something. I think that's probably a lot to do with his character, and maybe why he was getting a bit of a bad rap on the commentary was just the amazing job he's done of selling himself. He's doing an amazing, whatever he's doing, it is working because, he really is the main, almost, overshadowing outside of the performances. Probably Brody. He's kind of like the most well-known athlete on that team, right? So with that comes a little bit of pressure. Last year at the World Championships, I think that medal was a surprise. And when he fell on high bar in that last rotation, I couldn't help but my brain to jump back to Sam Mikulak in 2013 at the World Championships. And that kind of, in many ways, became a bit of I think that massively knocked his confidence when it came to all around. He couldn't quite put it together in all around competitions internationally after that. And I think that fall that he had at that World Championships probably played on his mind a lot. And with them both being from Michigan, I was like, oh no. But then he came through, he still got the medal, right? And you can only compete against who you compete against. So I think that was a surprise medal. And with that brings pressure as well going into this year. So I think that's maybe been an element. But having spoke to him, me and Sam sat here. Sam isn't a gymnastics fan, right? But he spent a lot of time around me. And we both afterwards were like, wow, this guy is special. He is going to have some kind of a career. So, I imagine in his head, I think it's been brilliant that he's managed to do enough to be second. He's not competed out of his skin, but like you say, you were very impressed with his relatively consistent performances, and the save he had on Pommel Horse was amazing, by the way. It was an incredible save. And I often think sometimes, you know, if you are going to be going out and competing 3 times, just to go through Pommel Horse those first, that really does make a difference, because a lot of athletes fell, right? So they're under pressure. But being able to say, if it comes down to a selection committee, say, well, I went through 4 times. So who do you want up in a team final? Do you want someone that's hit 4 routines, even if it is a scruffy routine? Because sometimes it's going to come down to that under pressure. And if you can just stay on in a team final, sometimes a 13 on pommel is enough, you know, because you don't want that, but that quite often is enough in a situation where lots of people are making mistakes. So yeah, that would be my opinions on Fred. And I think in his head, he's trying to peak for the Olympics, because having had that conversation with him, all he's thinking about is Olympic Games, that self-confidence that he's got. And I think he's probably, in his head, he's like, right, I need to do enough, but by the time the Games comes around, then I'll be ready. So it'll be interesting to see how close he can get to Brody in the next competition, because his difficulty is big, right? And I think if he can just clean that all up across the board, those low 14s could quite easily be mid-high 14s very quickly. Yeah, I think those would probably be my thoughts on Fred. Let's look at Coy then, Coy Young. A bit of a mixed bag with his performances, I felt, and he definitely, out of those 3, quite obviously has some weaknesses, whereas the other 2 are a lot more balanced as all-rounders. Would you say the same?
I would completely agree. Of course, pommel horse and vault, where he is an individual world medalist, are standout performances for him. He's really come a long way on parallel bars this year as well, scoring high 14s each time. His weakness is, of course, still rings. He just doesn't have the difficulty there. I think it's some of the lowest in the competition out of 4.8. I think he maybe even went lower on the second day of competition, maybe due to his stamina issues. And then his high bar has improved, but it is not what I would say is one of his strengths necessarily. So the interesting thing for me for Coy is he had the miss on day 1 on pommel horse. And if you had given him his day 2 score on day 1, he got a 15 on day 2, it would have upped his overall score by, I think, almost 3 points, which puts him right up there with Brody. And the thing with Coy is he can do 2 vaults at Olympic trials. So I confirmed with Brett earlier this year that to officially win that spot at Olympic trials, you do have to have the 2 vaults. So he can be top 3 on pommel horse. He can be top 3 on vault. He's very close on parallel bars as well, maybe another event. And I'm like, Coy, you could potentially do this, but you have to add back in that second vault to do it.
Do you think he's strong enough on pommels and vault, if they're going to go with 5 all-arounders, to carry his rings and carry potentially a weak high bar? And then also, if he wasn't to be, let's say they did select somebody for 3 or 4 events, who does he match up well with? Or would you expect him to be an all-arounder? If he's going to go, he's going to do 6.
Yeah, really good questions. So for me, my longstanding belief, and this kind of goes back into maybe why the U.S. team hasn't been as successful in a lot of recent years, is their vaults have been those 5.2 vaults for a really long time. They haven't had many athletes who've been able to break into that 5.6 and 6.0 difficulty value range, whereas that team last year had 2 5.6 vaults and a 6.0 difficulty vault, which I think was able to sort of catch up to Great Britain, who is an incredibly strong vault team. And so with vault being one of the events that, in my opinion, gets the fewest deductions, I think that is an area that Team USA should want to maximize. You want to have those 5.6 vaults. And the way the teams are sort of shaping up right now, which we'll get into more a little bit later, you're having a lot of those 5.2 vaults again coming in. And Coy right now on the highest scoring team, the only person with a 5.6 vault is Coy. So I think as long as he hits, I don't think that spot is going anywhere.
Right, okay, yeah. That's very interesting. Yeah, it's interesting what you point out there, because, yeah, if they are going to go all-rounders, yeah, there's a lot of that Cas 1.5 or the 2.5 twist. It's pretty much the standard vault, right? And his pommel horse is, you know, yeah, the fact. Also, let's just talk a little bit about that combination between pommel horse and vault. What a strange combination of apparatus to be good at, right? Like I can't really think of anybody else that is strong on pommel horse and and vault. Trying to think of somebody, but I can't really think of anyone.
I mean, like Uchimura was great everywhere.
Yeah, but I can't remember. He never did. He make a? I can't remember him ever
I
making a world vault final.
was thinking he did. I think he did, but I would have to double check that.
Yeah, because I think up until 2016, he would always compete as Yurchenko 2.5 until he started doing his Li Xiaopeng. And I can't
Maybe
really.
what I'm remembering is I feel like he often came in with different vaults and different entries, and the amount of variety in the vaults that he could do was so interesting. So I think I'm thinking like, of course he would have made a vault final because he could do all of these different vaults from different families.
Yeah, he certainly could. I mean, if he tried, he certainly could if he tried to. Maybe Vanayev, Oleg Vanayev. Maybe Oleg's made
Vanayev definitely made
vault finals and pommel finals. But yeah, quite a rare combination. So it's quite cool to see because and especially with his build, he's so slight, right? To then be very powerful on vault. And I often think that handspring 2.5 is just, it's like a secret weapon because there are no built-in deductions. You're not going to split your legs on the way on with that CAS 2.5. With most, you have to be very, very, very good to keep your legs together. And even with a handspring double front vault, we're still not seeing anybody do it with their legs together. So, there are built introductions to those two vaults. With the handspring 2.5, it's not. It's completely straight. So if you do the 2.5 and you stick, it's incredibly clean. So, yeah, I think you're probably right, listening to you talk about the likelihood and the makeup of the team and the fact he's got that 5-6 vault. And most of the teams, right, like the Japanese team, they've gone with Tanagawa for that Pike Dragulescu. The Chinese team, I'm sure they're going to, at minimum, going to have 3 triple twist. The British team are very, very strong on vault, right? So, yeah, they're going to need it to stay up there with the difficulty. I don't think you can't really get away now with just having 3 clean 2.5s. There's too much of a difference between those big vaults. And I think the countries that are competing the big vaults have had long enough to get them consistent at this point. Let's move on then to Yul Moldawa. What did you think of Yul's performance? I think I'm really impressed with, I think his gymnastics is getting better with his age. I think in the past, particularly the way he swung high bar was always an issue for me. Like, it was a massive weakness. I think he's improved there. Pommels used to be very inconsistent, and also his D score used to be quite low, whereas I think he's improved massively on there as well. I always used to, if he'd get through his whole routine, I'd be waiting for a mistake on the dismount. He seems to be way more consistent with doing that. I love his rings routine. I love his straight Homma swing to handstand. It's beautiful. It's such a hard skill to do without many deductions. So I like that. I like that he comes down from his handstand and then does his Azerian. I just think it's a very clever construction on his rings routine. His P-bars is obviously beautiful. Quite a unique routine. That's obviously going to be his big apparatus that he's going to bring to the team. Vault is going to be, that 2.5, and he has a history of doing well on floor. What did you think of his performance? There are a few kind of mistakes, right?
I think the thing that was most impressive to me is how strong he came back day 2. He spoke publicly about when he dismounted high bar with the triple double, the Fedorchenko, that he sort of stung his hip, and then he ended up having to go to floor, and then he made it through his floor routine. But I think vault was the main issue where he just didn't get quite the block. I have never seen him fall in vault ever. He is super consistent, often sticks. And for him to sort of end the meet there and come back and say like, okay, I'm going to be better. And he did. He improved his score by like over, I think, 3.5 points, something like that. And I think that just shows what a fighter Yul is. And that's a type of person that you want on a team who, if there's a mistake, they're going to come back and they're going to be even better. And he doesn't make mistakes often. He's one of the most consistent gymnasts that Team USA has right now, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think he has a very international aesthetic look to his gymnastics as well. And yeah, it's going to be there's so many all-rounders and they're so tight, because I thought very similar things to like Shane Whiskers. I think he's a very balanced all-arounder. His gymnastics, again, he's got a very clean aesthetic, international look to his gymnastics. I was impressed with him. They had joint scores, but obviously Yul had those mistakes on the first day, so that big difference in the second day. One thing I've always found odd is that he either does his back in full out off high bar or a triple double. There's no in between. He never does double double, which has always confused me a little bit when he does that triple double on high bar. So when I saw him do it, I was waiting for him to do back in full out, and then he did his triple double. It's always confused me that he never has an in between. So it's like like all or nothing kind of thing with his triple double.
Yeah, well, he actually trains about 30 minutes from where I live, so I actually get to go into the gym fairly regularly and just watch him train, so I should ask him that next time I'm
Ask him
down
that
there.
question because I can't even think of seeing him do double double, but he would either do a full twist or a triple double. I don't know why there's no kind of in between. But again, very impressive finishing on a triple double. And yeah, he obviously came back very, very strong on the second day. And I do like his look; it's very beautiful, like his gymnastics. Yeah, for sure. Okay, let's look at Shane Whiskers then. Very balanced all arounder. What were your observations of him and his performance? How many mistakes did he have? Because I didn't really see his day one. Did he have any mistakes on his day one?
You know, I don't they didn't show all of his routine, so I can't say for certain. I based on his s actually, let me take that back. I did see on rings, he ended up sliding off rings. Something happened either with his grip. I think he was in false grip and he just didn't get a good hand and ended up sliding off on still rings. Um, Very odd mistake, something we don't see super often. But he came back the next day and improved his score by over a point, so it was good there. But they didn't show a ton of his routines.
Okay.
But I will say what I was most impressed about with Shane is his ability to compete here, honestly, because when I spoke with him last year, he was in a ton of pain. He withdrew from it was a Pan American Champ Games. He was like, my back's hurt. I don't know if I'm going to continue. And then for him to come back and to be sitting in fifth place in the all around after all of that, I think, again, it speaks to his mental stamina and his ability to push through. When I did the podcast recap of this championships, my co-host brought up a really interesting point, which is that the change of format probably is a disadvantage to Shane because he doesn't necessarily have a medal event. He's just this really, really, really strong, consistent all-arounder.
Mm,
And when you have, four athletes on a team, that's the sort of athlete that you want. You want someone who can hit. But now that there's five athletes on the team and there's room to maybe bring a strong all-arounder like Paul Judah, who's just a little bit behind him,
mm,
but can make a vault final, can make a high bar final, maybe you
yeah.
choose someone like that over him.
Yeah. So do you feel like if he was to make the team, it would be because other people had made a lot of mistakes? Is that type of
I
athlete?
do.
Yeah.
I think that he is, which is, I hate saying this because you never want to say this to an athlete who has worked so hard, but for me, he is the perfect alternate this year
Hmm.
and just the way playing into the scenarios. Now, he has showed up in some of the highest scoring scenarios, so he's definitely not out of the conversation.
Yeah.
But based on how the teams are sort of shaping up, I think he'll probably end up in an alternate role, and that fifth spot will end up going to another strong all arounder who has the ability to make some event finals.
Okay, that brings us on nicely then to Danelle Wittenberg and also Asher Hong. Um, Interesting performance from Asher Hong, I think. It seems a little bit off to me comparatively to maybe where he was at the start of the year, and a lot of his college competitions seem to be forcing quite a lot. I was very impressed with Donald Wittenberg. You know, he's a real veteran at the moment, like right now. And do you know what? Like his vault, his rings, and his floor, very impressive. And I think I can't see a situation where you'd have both of those guys on the same team, right? But because they fill the same role. How did you feel watching both of them compete? And who do you think has the upper hand at the moment going into the Olympic trials? And do you feel the same? Do you feel like if either of them are going to be on the team, it's going to be one or the other?
I completely agree with you. I don't think that there is room for both of them on the Olympic team. I want to speak to Asher first because I think his performance was most shocking. He was down in 10th in the all around after day one. And you're right, he just doesn't look quite as fit. If you noticed, he would start off doing routines pretty well, pretty close to normal, but his dismounts would be incredibly low, like chest at his knees, or maybe would fall. And it just looks like his stamina is not there. And I
Hmm.
don't know why. It would be very interesting to see, like, has he not been putting in the hours? Is there something going on health wise? And I don't know. I'm just spitballing here, but something doesn't look quite right. And I think for me, probably Asher's best chance to make this Olympic team is for him to come back with an incredible all-around performance and be top 3 on 3 events. Again, another guy who can do 2 vaults. He can be top 3 on still rings and then put in, a killer floor routine as well. So I think Donnell has the upper hand. Asher's he's not out of the Olympic picture for sure.
Yeah.
But Donnell was incredibly consistent.
Yeah.
He had better all-around performance. He had better vault performance. He had he's incredibly strong on still rings. I think the thing that is hurting both of them right now in terms of like, okay, if the US is going to select a team by the numbers, the vault judging was incredibly tight at this competition, especially on those 6-0 difficulty vaults. And I don't know why the judging is so much tighter at these championships than it was at the World Championships. And sometimes, right, news comes down the pipeline through the judges saying, okay, for this Olympic cycle, we are going to be focusing on these 6-0 vaults and the vaults that, people are tucking off the top of the table to try and make it around. No, you really need to be extended. You need to be going up over the top instead of around the vault, right? And so they were hit pretty heavily there. And for that to be sort of your ticket onto the Olympic team and to have that event be hit so hard is hurting them. Because if you look at Paul Judah, who does that cause 1.5, but he does it about as perfectly as you can do it. He is one of those gymnasts that can do it with those legs glued together from the board. His form is exceptional and he often sticks it. He's scoring higher with a 5-2 vault than both of those 6-0 difficulty vaults. So that's going to sort of sway the competition as well.
Yeah, I just think, for me personally, if you are doing a 5-2 and you're competing internationally, even if you stick it, you're scoring a 14-7. They're not going to give you any higher than that. And
that is what he scored, but that was still higher than those 6-0 vaults.
But then if you take that step, you're then down to 14-4.
Right.
And it's a big risk having a 5-2 but needing someone to stick. Whereas, it would be interesting because that full in back out is virtually impossible to keep your legs together in the air. So whether they're taking the 3/10 on top of the vault going in or they're taking it in the air for the split, because when you come round with that late half twist, you can only grab one leg and then the other leg, and you'll end up with the gymnast will have that split in their legs. That's why you see kind of one leg trails the other. Whether they're taking it for that, I'm not sure, because I was also surprised when I saw Donnell's, I want to say 14-6 for his Risi Guang, and then Asher maybe 14.55 on that second day. So that is quite a heavy deduction. But I think you're right to point that out, because I think they would have scored much higher if they were competing internationally. I don't know what the judges were looking for in those deductions, whether there'd been some kind of feedback. I'm guessing in America, like in Great Britain, before the competition, the judges will have a conversation with the national coaching staff, and they'll and potentially the highest ranking judge that you have right now in the US, and they'll have a conversation about what they're looking for in the competition. So I'm not sure what was pointed out there. But I think if Donnell's focus will be on, I just have to beat Asher on those 3 events. And then if I am going to be selected, if someone, either of us it will be me. And then Asher is the same thing, right? But I think he will probably be he's got to do more. I think he's got to try and do a lot better all around. So I think the pressure will be on him. I think if he can perform really well, the style of his gymnastics is probably better. Aesthetically, I think it's nicer, it's cleaner. But it just seems like he was a bit off. I feel like I noticed that when he competed in the NCAAs, he didn't do 6 pieces. He did 4. I can remember thinking, he's done 4 apparatus. Whether that's an injury or whether up until that point he was just training 4 and now he's just added 2 apparatus in, maybe a little bit like someone like Courtney Tulloch in the UK would typically only do his 4 events and then at last minute just train high bar and floor maybe and add them in. I don't know whether it was a situation like that, but it will be interesting to see how he does and how those gymnasts, what they choose to do with their time between now and that Olympic trials.
Yeah, it's interesting that you bring up Courtney, because I feel like there are a lot of similarities between Courtney and Donnell, because both have been in the game for a long time. Both have made a couple world teams, got a world medal, and haven't ever achieved that dream of making that Olympic team. And they have similar strengths of rings and vault. And I think that there are a lot of people both in Great Britain and in the US who are rooting for them. And I think you even said so on your podcast that you are really rooting for him to make that team, which will be announced very soon. But I think that there is that sentimental value with Donnell as well.
Yeah, it's interesting to hear that. Yeah, everybody I speak to at the moment is saying, I hope Courtney's made it. Hope he's made it, you know. Because he is, you know, number one, he's had an amazing career, and that's the last thing that's kind of missing. He's been the reserve twice, and he is just a really nice guy. He's just a really nice guy. And, like, you just want the good guys to win in the end, don't you? I remember, you know, Courtney will be a similar age now, but I remember sending a message to Chris Brooks in maybe 2016 or 17. And I saw him make his first Olympic team at 27. And I was like, how did you do it, man? And he sent me this big, long paragraph. It was amazing. I might ask him if he'd be happy with me to read it out. But it was so good. It was brilliant. It gave me loads of motivation and inspiration. Anyway, the next few years, it just ended up with me having injury after injury. And it didn't go to plan. But I really appreciated the time he took to write that message. And I think that's a very similar position for quite a lot of athletes, right? They mature at different times. Maybe they're hardened by the sport. Politics plays a role. And they get to that kind of like last chance at 27, around that it always seems to be that age. And there's always someone that's kind of there in the mix when it comes around. So, yeah, it would be great for Donnell, similar to Courtney, to take those spots. But, yeah, I think if they are going to take somebody, it's interesting, right? Do they go rings, floor, vault heavy, or then you've got someone like Curran, right, who is parallel bars or high bar and can do the pretty good on vault, can do the other apparatus as well. So yeah, it is going to be interesting to see which way they go, and that will probably be determined maybe by that fourth all-arounder that makes it. You know, I think it won't be impacted maybe by the top two or even the third all-arounder, but that fourth one that they select is probably going to affect that last spot and which direction they go in.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I've said this before. I think that the best thing to ever happen to specialist or non-all-arounders was to have Brody Malone come back and be able to compete the all-around, because I am convinced beyond a shadow of a doubt that had he not been an all-arounder, he would have been the one to take that non-all-arounder spot simply just for his high bar. Not that he didn't contribute in other areas, but right, I think that high bar, that potential medal is his ticket onto the team. I would love to see Curran on this team. There's so many of the guys, right, who they work so hard and they have medal potential. And I think that this is such a shame with how athletes get chosen for the Olympic Games, because I think of Japan especially has so many medal contenders who will never see the light of day just because of how talented their team is, or they don't fit the team puzzle. I think of, you know, potentially Steven Netterossi getting left at home. Fantastic athlete, deserves a shot to compete, to be Olympic champion, may not fit the puzzle correctly. Kern Phillips, definitely in the conversation for an Olympic medal on parallel bars, but may not fit the puzzle because the U.S. is so deep on parallel bars. And right, every team has these athletes. And I would just love to see an Olympic Games sometime where it's like all of the best get to be there, regardless of if they fit the team scenario. And then we see, okay, who really is the best, not just the best of who you're competing against.
Yeah, I guess that's the negative of being so strong as a team, right? You know, if you are an individual that competes represents a country that don't have too many athletes, you know, chances are you're going to be there. But if your team is very strong, that's kind of like the other side of that coin of you then get the benefits of the funding and the support and the opportunities that the other countries don't get. So it's kind of checks and balances. And yeah, it just makes I think the one thing that I would say is that you guys have a lot of depth right now. It's quite frightening. You know, compared to Great Britain, you're looking at like the British Championships, it was quite worrying, the depth, the lack of it. You guys, it's, very, very impressive for those next teams behind China and Japan, who you always expect to have incredible depth. Yeah, I was very, very impressed.
We had, the U.S. had 16 or 17 athletes, I think, go over 80. And I listened to your episode with Catherine, and I think she said like 40 of their Japanese athletes could go over 80. And then you look at the British, and there were 3 who went over 80. And those differences are staggering for sure.
And that has to translate to team scores. It has to. Like, And that's definitely something that the British, I'm sure they're looking at, but will be worried about going into the next cycle. And I think the positive is obviously that the men's junior team took the title back. Obviously, that's without Russia, but I watched that performance, and those juniors were incredibly impressive. So, hopefully they can somehow like fill that gap, because it is an aging team right now, the British team. Maybe a little bit different actually to where I'd say the American team off the top of my head is probably more mid-20s, whereas I think the British team is, pushing that late 20s, close to 30s now, and there certainly will be a big shift after this Olympic Games in the makeup of that team within Great Britain. And I think the last of that our generation of when I was still involved is kind of finished, and will be finishing in the next few years. Were there any specialists or standout performances from the championships that stood out, Kensley, that, like we just said, potentially are going to miss out on the Olympic Games?
I mean, first of all, Curran's 15.5 on parallel bars. His routine is so complex, and he has done some amazing work to become consistent. I think consistency used to be his biggest problem, but he has hit every routine since he won the medal at the Pan American Games last year, I think. Again, I mentioned the issue for him is the U.S. is already really, really strong on parallel bars. So I actually think his ticket onto the team is, of course, his parallel bars, but it's, can you add on high bar? Your vault. He is training a Yurchenko triple. That's that 5-6 vault, right? And it looks pretty good. Can you show up at Olympic trials and hit that consistently over 2 days? I think that actually might be the ticket onto the team in combination with that parallel bar routine.
Right, okay.
For Nedorosik.
Sorry,
go ahead.
Go on, Kensley. I was going to say that, and that vault is a very tricky vault. That to do a Yurchenko triple twist, it has to be very precise. That's why not many people do it. If you remember back when Max used to compete it, I mean, that used to stress everybody else out, let alone Max, because it's the contact on the vault has got to be just perfect. To do a 2.5, you can really just over rotate, not get a good block, and you just step forwards. But to do a triple, you almost have to pause in the air and then fit the 3 twists in. So, that will be a difficult vault to hit 2 days in a row if he's not competed it before or many times. So, but that is the type of thing, right? And at Olympic trials, I remember the first time I watched the American Olympic trials was in 2004. And for some reason, it was on British TV. And I was flicking through the channels in the nighttime, and it came on, and I was like, oh my, this is incredible, because I never get to watch gymnastics on TV, especially back then. And I couldn't believe it, and I remember watching it. Now, it wasn't the men, it was just the women's Olympic trials, but they did show highlights from the men. So that was kind of where my love for like American gymnastics and then dreaming of going to compete in the American Cup one day like came from. So at those Olympic trials, like you said, it's a sellout event. It's going to be awesome. Are they doing it? How are they running it, Kensley? Are they doing it men and women at the same time, same weekend? No, different weekends.
So it's the same weekend, different days.
Okay, so okay, great. So
men
you will
on
get
Thursday,
that.
Saturday, and women Friday, Sunday. And the women's competition on Sunday is very late. It's quite late. So, but it has to be, for prime time TV on the East Coast and on the West Coast as well. So it's going to be a late night for all of us, but I'm sure it's going to be a great competition.
That, with it being, a very high pressured event, right? And in many cases, to be honest, those Olympic trials and qualifying for Olympic Games is more stressful than the actual games itself. Once you've made it, you're kind of there, right? I'm at an Olympics, I'm going to be an Olympian. Who do you think that benefits that situation, that high-pressured situation, out of those athletes that we talked about? And I know we missed off Paul Judah today in our conversation, and, maybe take a few minutes to talk about him and his beautiful aesthetics and his gymnastics. His flares, by the way, are just incredibly beautiful. But who do you think that pressured situation of an Olympic trials with the TV cameras, we're so close to Olympic Games at that point, you're going to have all the media outlets and the journalists, they're all going to be there. Who does that environment benefit the most? What type of athletes do you feel will perform best under that pressure and that spotlight?
Oh, I mean, Fred, of course. Fred loves the spotlight. And Yul too. Yul loves a crowd, and Yul can create a crowd for himself. I don't know if you saw on the broadcast, the national championships didn't sell out for some reason, and actually the crowd at for the men's nights was a little bit thin.
Yeah.
But Yul was like finding people in the crowd and like waving to them and getting them hyped up. And that's just the type of person that he is, that he really can bring that energy in. So I think probably Fred and Yul are the two that will really thrive in that environment.
Amazing. And just to finish off then, Kensley, what are your predictions for the Olympic Games and for Paris? You know, we obviously don't know the team, so it would be great if you could give us a prediction of who you think is going to make that team ahead of time. And then potentially we're going to look at revisiting this after the Olympic trials and we can see how close we kind of get to those predictions. But who do you expect to be on that team for Paris? And then what would your predictions be for the team final in terms of a top three? Just now that we're a month out and we can do this again. And then the top three all around.
Okay. I think that assuming they compete similarly, Brody, Fred, Coy, and Yul are probably locks for the team.
Okay.
I think that fifth spot will probably come down to Paul Judah and Donnell Wittenberg. And don't ask me to choose because I really couldn't at this point. I think that they're both fantastic. And of course, both deserve a spot. And you asked me to spend a moment talking about Paul Judah, so I'll bring that in here.
Yeah.
Paul Judah, for those who don't know, actually earned the individual Olympic spot for Team USA at the last Olympics. And that spot ended up going to Alec Yoder, the pommel horse specialist. And Paul wasn't even named an alternate for that team. And I felt like that was a grave disservice to him after he went out and won that spot. And so I think, right, he also has that redemption arc story of, hey, I went out and earned this spot for the team. And he's done that again last year, being part of that bronze medal winning team. And like for him to have that Olympic redemption as well, as I think would be great.
Yeah, and I don't know why, but he seems to go, for me, and I don't pay as much of attention as I used to gymnastics. I'm doing that more now, particularly with the podcast, right? Because, you know, I want to come prepared and I want to kind of have a feel of what's going on and have my ear to the ground. But he has slipped under the radar with me a little bit, like maybe doesn't have those clear standout performances and big, massive gymnastics, but aesthetically does very beautiful gymnastics. So, I certainly don't. I hope if he listens to this podcast, it's not a slight on his gymnastics at all. I just don't know as much about his gymnastics as I do the others. But he obviously was part of that team last year. Like you said, was the guy that qualified that spot. I'm sure NBC or ABC, whoever's covering the Olympic trials, they'll do one of those big fluff pieces that they always do. That will be his story, his kind of story that they go for. But yeah, it will be very, very interesting to see who ends up on that American team. But I think regardless of whoever the top five are, it's going to be a very, very strong team. Give me your predictions then. I know we've focused on the American team. Give me your top three predictions for the team final. Catherine was interesting. She was very unsure. She's very confident about China at the moment. I do tend to feel like China seem to be a little bit more inconsistent when it comes to an Olympic Games. You just don't know what you're going to get from them. And I think I'd kind of put more faith in Japan for me personally at this point. But yeah, I'd like to know your top three. What do you think?
Yeah, them leaving off Jung Bo-hung for the 2020 Olympics will always be a mystery for the ages, and what could have been for that team had they not decided to go with more experience and just gone with the athlete who is actually better prepared.
Yeah.
China is so hard because I don't know what their selection is. So my gut says Team Japan, China, USA, but for all around Jung Bo-hung, Hashimoto Daiki. And that third spot is so tough. It really feels like it's a race between a ton of athletes, between Shinosuke, whoever the second all-arounder from China will be. I think Brody Malone's in that conversation. I think Carlos Yulo's in that conversation. That race for that bronze is going to be really, really interesting.
It's going to be that top six, if they do six that start on floor, will be great to watch. But even that, in Olympic Games, you get the best of the best. So even that second six that start on pommel is going to be amazing too. And I think sometimes it's actually turns out to be an advantage starting on pommel and finishing on floor. So you don't have to finish on high bar. That can be a real advantage. So sometimes it's great to see which order people placed in. I think you're right in that group. I think there's a real group there, probably Covington I'd put in that group as well. And potentially Jake Jarman, you never
Absolutely.
know, right? Like, depending on what high bar routine he can put out there, what rings routine he does. But I mean, with that vault, his parallel bars can be pretty high. If he's starting to get more consistent with his floor routine, he could be in with a shout if he does his casino on high bar and puts it in the all-around final, just goes for it. But I do think, yeah, there's that real mix of guys that are around 86. They're kind of at that 86 mark, trying to, on a good day, push for 87. But yeah, it's going to be incredibly exciting. What are your, as someone that follows men's gymnastics, Kensley, and is someone that is, you know, ingrained in the American system, what are your outside perspectives of the British team at the moment?
I agree with your assessment about them being a team looking more towards potentially individual medals. They obviously are in the conversation for a bronze medal, and I would say the top, right, 6, 7 athletes in the British circuit can absolutely challenge the Americans and the Ukrainians, but there isn't depth. And if one of those athletes goes down,
Yeah.
they're really, really going to be struggling in the team. I obviously, I think still in the conversation for making team final, but I think to win the medal, they all have to stay healthy.
Yeah.
And I think that that's a really scary position to be in. Whereas the US, if any of those athletes go down, there's a slew of very comparable gymnasts who could come in and compete.
Yeah, I think if the British men are going to go and win a medal, and I do back that they can do that, I think they can do it. I mean, they've shown, I think, in recent years that they can, and I was actually very impressed with the performance of the Europeans as well. And they've shown in recent years that if there is a mistake, they can come back. I think they can't afford to have mistakes, but I don't think they've had a perfect day yet. And I think they could have if they have a perfect day, I think they're definitely up there and they could beat the US team. But I think it's going to come down to the athletes driving that team performance, because I don't think it's going to come from the top. I think there's probably a lot of pressure coming from the powers that be in terms of individual medals and keeping hold of funding. So I think it will be the athletes being in an Olympic Games, and depending on the makeup of that team, if you were to have the likes of Courtney in that team alongside Joe and maybe like James, who have been in that team so many times and maybe understand the value of what winning an Olympic team medal means, they could drive the emphasis on being on the team, even if top down the focus is actually we select a team for individual medals, but the athletes might force that into action, if that makes sense. That's a scenario where I see that potentially happening.
And they'll be hungry too. I mean, there's nothing that's as motivating as just missing out on the medal, right? They had that glory in 2022 at home and then missed out on the medal last year. That's very motivating.
And this is the last shot. A lot of these guys will see this as the last shot to win an Olympic medal, right? You know, those guys have had incredible careers, but all of them except for Max, the one thing that's missing is an Olympic medal. So they're, you know, and they will, yes, individually you can win an Olympic medal, but realistically, like, the team medal is a great opportunity to try and do that, and for everybody to get one all at the same time, right? And I've learned the value of what that means to be an Olympic medalist for the rest of your life. No matter what you do after that, that counts for a lot, whether it's the rest of your career and when it comes to selections or whatever it might be, but then the life that you go into after gymnastics, it's an amazing thing, and those guys have seen that play out with the generation before them. So yeah, I am backing them to do it. Obviously, I'm British. I want us to do it. I want us to beat the Americans. I want us to beat you guys. But yeah, it is, your depth at the moment is frightening, and it's very impressive, and it bodes well for the future. But Kensley, it's been amazing to speak to you. Thank you very, very much. I'm sure our listeners will find this incredibly valuable. I'm going to be, I'll keep in contact with you going into the Olympic trials. I'll be watching intently. Hopefully I'll be able to try and watch them live. That would be great. I wasn't able to do that with the Japanese competition because they're the other way around. So that was kind of like 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. I was very tired with my little boy not sleeping too much. But yeah, I'm going to do my best to watch them, and hopefully we can do this again before the Olympic Games. But thank you for everything that you do. The Neutral Deductions channel that you have is amazing. It's brilliant. It's so detailed. the analysis, it's so fast after competitions. I clicked on the page just earlier and saw that you had the Canadian results come up. So it's brilliant for a gymnastics fan like myself that had nothing to go to when I was a kid growing up. Men's gymnastics had nothing like this. It's great that you're doing it, and there's little pockets of people now that are, it's becoming a potential career for people to analyse the sport of gymnastics. So keep doing it, and yeah, all the best and enjoy the championships.
Thank you.
Take care. Thank you.